Hey folks, my name's Kevin and it's time for a little bit more knife nerdery, and today we're going to be taking a small details but relatively short look at this, wow man, I love the noise it makes, at this Koenig Arius. This is not a full small details review. In fact, this is not a review at all. I just haven't had this knife all that long, and I'm not going to have it long enough to really get to know it. And I'm also very intentionally not doing any cutting with it whatsoever, because I know for a fact it's just not a me knife. It's not going to stick around my collection, and so I want to be able to sell it as like new in box still. But before I sell it, I wanted to take a look with you guys about just some of the things I think this knife is doing really, really well, because this is a very impressive knife, but also some of the stuff that I think they should just do differently, and things that I think would just be objectively better if they were done differently, and talk through why this is not going to stick around my collection. So to start things off, let's look at this blade, because this is certainly one of the things that is most iconic and recognizable about this knife. It is a very unique blade. It's a very tall, big, long blade. It's just a big blade. It's a full 3.5 inches and it's a full 1 3/8 inches tall. It's a full 4 millimeters. That's 0.1675 blade stock. And so yeah, it's just kind of a big, thick blade, and it has this really big belly at the front, and it's got this really recognizable kind of eye-shaped looking thing here, which is both a fuller and a hole. It's just kind of different in terms of how blades are done. And on the one hand, that's different is cool, different is good, different makes them stand out. And on the other hand, though, it just makes this not a super me blade. I personally don't want a 3.5 inch blade. If it's going to be 3.5 inches, I don't want it to be like a big chunk of blade for that entire thing. I also don't want a big belly for my own personal needs. I know some people want or need a big belly in the knife because they get based on the kind of cutting they're doing. But I like low down tips and things that work better for utility cuts. And so that, combined with the fact that this is thick blade stock by my standards, means that this is just not a me blade. But this is a very impressive hollow grind. It's a very tall, deep hollow grind, and people that have cut with this knife tell me repeatedly that it is a fantastic slicer. It doesn't get crazy thin behind the edge down here. This is like 21 to 22 thousandths, but that's a good entry point. And the fact that this is such a thicker blade stock to begin with means that that is actually a pretty impressive swoop down. This is a tall hollow grind, which means it's going to cut certain kinds of material really, really well. Hollow grinds in general cut materials well if those materials are able to splay quickly, or if they're thin enough that they don't actually reach high enough on the blade for the point where it then spreads back out. So this being a tall hollow grind like this means it's going to cut through cardboard really, really well, or cut through packaging, cut through like rope, cut through string, and I don't know, things that are shorter and that splay easily, because this blade will stay very, very thin for a long time, long enough for the materials to be either completely severed, or by the time they do come up there, stuff like cardboard just easily does bend. Double-walled cardboard or things like styrofoam or anything like that, stuff that doesn't want to splay as easily, that's going to suck for this type of thick blade stock. But in general, I do trust people that this is a very slicey blade just because of how tall it is. Aesthetically, we talked about how it's like differently shaped than a lot of knives in a way that makes it look really iconic. I think it's the kind of thing that either you love or you hate, or maybe it grows on you. But I think they are doing some really cool stuff on the finishing here. The blade finish on this is this really kind of neat, they call it, like on the COA, they say that it is M390 burnished. I honestly don't know what that is. Like the F is probably flats. I don't know what the P stands for, and I couldn't find it easily when Googling, although I just didn't Google hard enough. Like I said, I haven't had this super long, but I think what they're talking about here is like this, I think is what they're calling burnished. And it's this really neat kind of smoky, ghosty quality where you can sort of see vertical lines in it, but that it still has this almost, yeah, it just has this neat cloudy effect. It's different from what you'll find on a bead blast finish, or just honestly, I don't know what combination of things they're doing to make it happen. It's pretty cool looking. And at the top, actually, I should have left that zoomed in. This is what they're doing with the flats. I don't know what the P stands for, but it's neat because it has these horizontal lines that are similar to what you'd find on like a hand satin. But these aren't hand satin lines. Those are usually long and uniform. These are really short and kind of scattered about. It's just a really neat contrast there. Also, right here, we have what appears to be a bead blast finish, which means maybe this is a bead blast. I don't really know how they're doing that. They kind of look similar, but it's just a lot of cool contrasting patterns. And I think that's a pretty cool effect. So yeah, aesthetically, I think they're doing some really neat stuff there. There is like a matte kind of cloudy, ghosty finish along the top of this too. And that's really neat because it kind of blends in with the overall look of this. I just think they're doing some cool aesthetic stuff. This handle wise is what they call their smooth handle. It's what a lot of people call their plain Jane handle. They make ones with neat milling patterns. I like those a lot better. But one of the things about this is where I'm going to start getting a little bit critical. So one of the things that people say about this, so many people that really know knives and have a lot of really high-end knives refer to this knife as kind of the be-all end-all of production knives. And so I was really curious to see what the finishing would be like, because I've handled a lot of really high-end production knives from companies like Riot, and also really, really high-end semi-production knives from people like Holt and folks like Oz Machine Company and Craig Brown and stuff like that. I haven't held any of the skiffs yet, but I've looked really, really close at them. I've handled stuff from Shirogorov, other things that are like really high end and sort of production or are full on production. And so the fact that so many people refer to this as like the be all end all tippy top of what production can look like, I don't know. I had really high expectations, and it's not so much that it didn't meet my expectations. It's just that I don't 100% know that I agree. I think this is extremely well made, but I feel like some of the finishing specifically just doesn't quite live up to what I've seen elsewhere. What I want to get at is like here, like this handle finish that we talked about as a plain, what they call their smooth. It has this neat kind of ghosty quality on it. I don't know if it's going to catch, but I did find that there's this like really slight thing that might be considered like a very tiny snail trail right there. I don't know if the camera's going to pick it up. And that came like that. But if we look at what's actually going on with this finish here, I'm going to zoom in and see if I can get this on the light. You can see these horizontal lines still. And some people think that's cool. Some people will call that like maybe micro pinstriping or something, but it's not. It's not pinstriping. What this is visible remnants of the machining. Like that's you being able to see the machining marks still underneath the finish. And some people are into that. Some people will actively like the way it looks. It honestly looks kind of cool. But I know some people, like my friend Casper, would absolutely hate that like remnants of the machining left behind would become what they consider sloppy finishing. I don't know. I'm not going to go as hard as to call it sloppy finishing. I'm not. But it's the kind of thing that you just don't find that remnants of the machining on a lot of the other things that are in this price point. I'll give you another example. Back here on this backspacer. Now this is a cool backspacer. I really love the way that they put the jimping here. It does add traction, but look what's going on right here. So this, again, some people will probably think this looks cool. I kind of think it looks cool. These lines are very uniform and it's kind of a neat effect. But I'm like 98% confident that this is not an intentional striping finish they're putting on, and that this is just the machining marks of how they made this knife. And it's not that it looks bad. It's just that if you were looking at a knife in a comparable price point, there's not a lot of knives in a comparable price point, but a lot of those ones would have like a perfectly smooth finish here, or they would have a finish that is asymmetric or ribbed in some way, but it would be applied intentionally, and it wouldn't just be the machining marks left over. And so again, I'm not saying any of this stuff is bad. It's just, I don't know. I just don't, this feels more like a Riot knife to me than like a Holt or a Craig Brown knife. And that's fine. I think that's putting it in really, really high, like that's putting it with really, really high grade peers. Like Riot makes spectacular knives, but honestly, even like this kind of machining line finishing here is something that you don't find on Riot knives. And so unless I'm just flat out wrong and this really is an intentional finish, I don't know. I don't know how I feel about it. Okay, but let's ignore the finishing from them and just kind of talk about the construction of this and the machining of this, because aside from the finishing aspect of the machining of this is holy crap levels of amazing. Like, there is such good, clean, specific lines everywhere. All of the corners have been rounded off so well. There's so many micro chamfers that make this so incredibly complicated. Let's look at the pocketing inside this, because oh, wow, this is skeletonized, like wildly, wildly skeletonized. There are pockets everywhere. There's pocketing in the lock bar itself that you almost never see, and the pockets are super deep. One thing I want to point out here is that there is a chamfer going around the inside of that. That is some next level stuff right there. That's some very small details that they don't need to do, but they've done to make this just really, really nice and really, really high end. You will see some of the other companies that are up above this price point, things like Holtz that take that even further, and like the Holtz will actually put a feather milling pattern on the inside of their pockets, which is just kind of insanity. But this pocketing is so extensive, so well done, and that kind of smooth chamfer cleaning off all those edges, that is very, very impressive. Now, that pocketing really does reduce the weight on this. This is still a heavy knife by my standards. It's not heavy, it's just heavier than a lot of stuff I carry. It's 4.73 ounces. But it's heavy in the way that it's not like heavy for its size. It's just a bigger knife than I typically carry. And the balance point on it is actually superb. It's like right there. Let me get that actually balanced correctly. Right there. And that is right where your finger goes when you hold this knife. And so that means that while 4.7 ounces is definitely on the high end of anything I own in my collection, this knife feels spectacularly nimble and well balanced. You can feel the weight of it, but it's so big and thick and laid out in a way that I think just makes it so that it feels like it fills your hand in a really nice way. And like I said, that balance point is just spot on. And so you can definitely feel the tip moving, and it doesn't feel like you're swinging a big heavy blade around. I think they did a great, great job of that. And I think that's part of what makes me think that the smaller version of this really would be much more up my alley, because they've done a lot of stuff here really, really well. One of the big things is that the ergos on this are just really, really, really nice. This is, like I said, consistently, I've been saying, this is a bigger knife than I want. This is a bigger knife than I normally have, and this is just a too big knife for me. The 3.5-inch blade and a full 5-inch handle, 5.07 actually. But the shape of this, even in my hand, when this is like kind of too big for me, kind of not, this just feels so nice. The swells where it goes, it feels so locked in. It's neat. It's really neat how it does that. This is not, a lot of people just don't think about the fact that this is not a Koenig design. Bill didn't design this knife. This is a TJ Schwartz design. And I think this is one of those things that kind of shows that TJ Schwartz really understands ergonomics, because this just locks you in so well. But even with it feeling so good in my hand, I can just feel how big it is in my hand. I just know it's too big for me. This backspacer is pretty cool. It does break one of my cardinal sins. I don't like when the backspacer protrudes above the handle, because it puts all of the weight back here. And that matters more on knives that are flipper tab knives, because on a flipper tab knife, you typically anchor it into your hand like this. And so the back is pushing into your hand. But I think they've done a really nice job of smoothing this out and having this being rounded. And so while I think it's just because this knife is kind of thick overall. Like, this is a 0.5625-inch knife. This is a thicker knife. And so the result is that this backspacer is kind of thicker. And so when it pushes into my hand, even though it's concentrating just on this one point and not the full thickness of the handle, I don't mind it. It doesn't hurt. And like I said before, this jimping here really does add nice traction there. And so overall, I think that is done really cool. You can also tell that it has these channels in it right there. And that aesthetically mirrors this channel here. I think that's a cool tie-in where this shape is similar to that shape, and this kind of channel coming out is similar to that channel coming out. But this also has a functional purpose, because it allows the paracord in your lanyard to rest up and nestle in that and sit in that channel, and when it is sticking in your pocket. Talking about other things they've done that are pretty cool. I love when they have a asymmetric pivot, and that's what's making it captive. That's, I think, one of the cooler ways of doing it, because you can make something look neat and it also just works better than the D shape that gives you a spot in your pivot for gunk to collect. I will say, I both kind of love and hate this pivot, because on the one hand, I think it looks cool. On the other hand, and I also think it having a really deep kind of concave part right here feels neat and is a cool anchor point in your hand. I like in a pinch grip that I can kind of put my thumb there and feel where I am and feel secure. What I don't like about it is that these top edges, this goes back to kind of that last mile finishing. These top edges are all really crisp. And this is one of the things on the knife that's actually quite sharp, and there's not a lot that is sharp, so it stands out that this is kind of oddly sharp. The other thing that I'm going to say is sharper than I want it to be is this lock bar. Now, I talked in my unboxing video that there's been a bunch of iterations of this lock bar jimping, and this is definitely in Gen 4 here the best lock bar jimping they've had. It's really nice and crisp, but doesn't hurt, and nice and shallow. But what I don't love is that this edge, while there is a micro chamfer going the entire way, it's a micro chamfer, and so this edge here is still like a full-on 90-degree angle practically. And so pushing against this, since this is a reasonably stiff lock bar, I just find that it's like I'm pushing against a hard edge. And I think it would feel better if it was more fully scalloped and gave me a flatter surface to push against instead of pushing against this. They did knock off the absolute corner, but barely. And so I just don't find it super comfortable to unlock. Pocket clip wise, this is like TJ Schwartz. Let me pull out his other knife that I have. So this is the Millet Torrent, and this is another TJ Schwartz design. You can definitely see commonality in the body, in the like the swoop here and everything like that. And he did the same thing here on this, where he just could have put this much deeper. The curves of this pocket clip would nestle perfectly into this back spot, and they could move this all this way back. And they just didn't. And similarly over here, the curves here would fit perfectly in this back corner, and they could use this back screw here and have it be a fully hidden hardware thing. They're doing a hidden hardware thing already, but they could have made this come up through here and sit right there, and it could sit so much deeper, and they just didn't. And that kind of stuff bugs the heck out of me when they could make a knife deeper carry and just don't. But this clip is cool. It actually has a lot in common with this in the sense that the same way that this has this cutout in the blade that is then echoed and mirrored back here, they did the same thing here, where this cutout in the blade is echoed and mirrored back here. But they did an even cooler thing where you can read what generation this is. This is Gen 4 Batch 9 in that little window. And I think that's just such a fun detail. I love Easter eggs like that. It's worth noting that aside from this word Koenig here, which is also hidden in kind of an interesting spot, that there's not a lot of billboarding or branding on this knife. There's not a giant logo somewhere. I would personally like to see that Koenig also hidden somewhere, like maybe right here. But I love this kind of pocket window keyhole looking thing going in. And I just think it's a cool looking pocket clip. I did slide this in out of my pocket a couple of times. It is a good functioning clip. One of the things that you can see is this side here, the fact that they have this big window all the way up to the top, it actually carries over, and you can see that it's hollow in the middle. And what that means is that it's putting all of the weight on the outside. It's not a solid pad. And of course it's not going to be a solid pad because this big window is right here, but it's not a solid pad even at the very tip. I have mixed feelings about that, because when knives put all of the weight on the sides of the pocket clip, it means that, or like in a single point, or like on the Olamic knives that put it on like a ceramic ball, anytime that you're putting all of the weight of the pocket clip on a narrower and narrower spot, it means it's going to put a lot more pressure and wear out that spot. So if you do slide this in and out of your pocket on a regular basis, it means in the exact same spot, it is going to wear just more because you're not distributing that force across a wider pad. But it does have good spring tension. It is a really good functioning clip in terms of sliding in and out and staying in pocket. Coming back here, there's this really interesting elongated chamfer spot right here. You'll find on some knives that they'll have a little spot that's milled out in the sides right here, and it's going to act as like a landing zone. And what's the point of that is for when you do a push button, your finger comes down. And if you give this kind of milled out spot right here, it gives you a nice kind of cushioned area for your finger to land. But the thing is you can see where my finger is ending. It's right about there. And so why does this extend all the way back? I honestly don't understand a functional purpose. I guess if you were doing like a really intense light switch, you could slide. Even then, I would have to like slide all the way back to there. It's not going to happen. And the thing is this does kind of have a negative, because by adding this chamfer here, you make it easier for your finger to go in. Like up here where it's the full thickness in, I can't get my finger in very deep, but here I can get it in much deeper. And that matters because that's the blade right there. And so like I can definitely touch this blade. Like I'm touching it this entire way. I'm touching right there. And it'd be easy for me to shove my finger in there in a way that would kind of nick it. And I think, especially with a smaller finger like my pinky, like, yeah, that's the blade right there. Now, I'm not super worried about that when it comes to sliding my hand in, because of the fact that this whole knife curves this way. That curvature does mean that it sits really, really nicely in your hand as well in this kind of pinch grip. I think, again, the ergos on this are just masterclass. But that curve in means that when you're sliding your hand in like this in your pocket, that's really far out of the way. Like you'd have to like weirdly twist your hand around and try to slide back in. So I'm not worried about this being like getting nicked here, but it's the kind of thing where like, why is it like this then? Like, why have this big pocket here when I don't see a functional reason for having it, and it is technically exposing you to the blade? Those pockets like this do add kind of a nestling spot in your thumb. Like if you kind of put your thumb right here, it can slide back and forth a little bit more, but these landing zones do also provide a nice kind of anchoring point for your thumb. But again, it doesn't need to extend all the way back here for that. Like for me to actually be using this back part, I would need to be holding the knife like this. And like, when the heck am I ever going to hold the knife like that? That's a really weird way. But you can see, because this is such a larger knife and my hands are medium glove size hands, I still have a full 4-finger grip when I hold it back here. So again, odd design choice to have extend all the way back. I don't see a functional benefit, and I kind of think it would be better off if they didn't, but whatever. Let's finally get into the big thing. So as I've said numerous times, this knife is just too big for me. And that's the major final straw reason why this isn't going to stick around. But the thing is, there's the way that this detent system is done, I don't like, and I think it should, not just could, but should be done differently. And it's the fact that this knife is too big for me that makes it so that I'm not going to mess with it at all. Because on knives that have a detent that I don't like, I usually will try to tinker with it and tune it in some way to see if I can get it to behave more the way I want. But the fact that this is definitely just too big for me and not quite the kind of blade that I want means that I'm not going to mess with this at all to see if I can make it work the way I would want. But I also don't think that this is the kind of detent I don't like, quote unquote, that is really something you can tune correctly. So let's talk about what's going on here. This is a very poppy detent. Like this is... Do you hear that? What's going on here is that this is a very firm detent created by fully deep engagement. Like if we look at this, you can see that this ball is all the way up touching. Like this lock bar is all the way touching. The detent ball is all the way engaged. And what that means is that it's sitting really low down on the detent ball. The higher up you are, the like shallower your slope is, and the easier it is to push up that. But if you come down really far down, you're pushing up against what is basically a perfectly vertical. If you come all the way down the edge, it's a perfectly vertical wall. And what that would mean is that all of your force would be going that way and none of it would be going down. So if you come up just above that, you're almost perfectly vertical. And the impact that has is that it means that it requires a lot of force to actually push it out. And because it's pushing up against a basically flat surface, it makes this kind of like pop out all at once thing. That's what gives it that poppy sound. You can also see that when I press on this, you can see that the lock bar actually torques outward. You see it flexing outward? It does that up into the point that I do. And what that means is that too much of my force is going this way rather than going this way and pushing the lock bar out. And the impact of this is that this is a very firm detent. But the other impact of this is that it's extremely sensitive to lock bar pressure. So this is the kind of thing where on a flipper tab knife, you want to be able to pick up the knife and just kind of flick it open, right? Well, I have to go out of my way to keep my finger off this lock bar in the back to be able to use this flipper tab. If I just rest my finger on this, I'm not pushing on it, I'm not pushing inward, I'm just picking up the knife and holding it in my hand the way I would naturally hold it. My finger's on that. And right now, I literally cannot. Oh, okay. It finally did pop out. I was pushing basically as hard as my fingers would do. And I'm not pushing on this, but there's another thing going on that when you are gripping something like this and trying to squeeze and push in, your natural tendency, if you're trying to push in on this, is to anchor the rest of the thing even harder in order to give you a firm grip to push against, which means your natural tendency when it is being locked up like that is to squeeze in here and put even more pressure on. And so this is the kind of design where the natural way I want to hold it locks up. I can't open it the way that it just naturally fits in my hand. Let me back up and talk about how this finger flick works. Like, this is a firm enough thing that even if I pay attention to where my fingers are and make sure I'm not on this lock bar, I can't use my nail to flick out here. I can't. And no matter how hard I push on it, I just slide out. Part of what's going on there is that this fuller design, it's an aesthetic thing. It's not really super functional in any kind of meaningful way, especially because it doesn't extend out that way. Like, one of the points of fullers, if they're not going to be functional, is that they are like kind of a drainage point. Like, if you are working in a wet environment, water can flow out. With knives like this, where the fuller goes inward, if anything, water is going to flow into the pivot, which I don't love. But this is like a whole knife. You don't actually use this fuller for deploying, and it's really smooth right there. And so this is not the kind of thing, this is just an aesthetic thing. And so the problem with it is that it means that when you're pushing in this direction, you've got this concave part right here to push against. So like, my nail is not making very good traction. It's only hitting really on the sides like this. And so it's a hard to flick out knife in that way. And they've made it even harder by making it so that by putting this fuller here, like this is, if you're going to have a knife that is this hard of a detent and this sensitive to lock bar pressure, they shouldn't have a fuller here, and they should try to make it so you get as good a contact as possible. I honestly can't really flick with my nail at all, like, no matter how much I try. And again, I'm being careful not to put pressure on this lock bar. In order to flick this, you kind of have to use the meat of your finger, and it works. Like, it certainly works. It works quite well. But you have to flick kind of out more. You can't really flick up. You can kind of do it, but it's harder to do because of the fact they have that fuller and that this corner in there is like kind of soft and roundy. You just don't get great grip. And so, again, this is the kind of thing where, like, it works, sure, but it's not the way I like to flip. I don't like pushing the meat of my finger against a hard, crisp edge like this. Yeah, there's a micro chamfer, but it's still a hard, crisp edge. And so I find that operating this knife is something that you have to be really intentional. And I also find that it kind of just wears my finger down. I don't like the sensation of flicking it. It doesn't feel good. I prefer knives that I can flick with my finger like this or like this. And this knife, I can't really do. Like, if I do this, I slide off. I think if I really push, okay, I did get it to work, but it's the kind of thing where, like, the normal ways that I flick a knife just don't work. And I hate that. I hate that it works that way. And it's all because of the way that they've done this detent system. This is odd enough. Like, this is uncharacteristic enough of how I expect a knife to operate that I actually contacted Bill to see if this is the intended design, or if my particular one is just tuned slightly wrong and like slightly a lemon or something like that. And I want to be very clear right now that Bill's response to me was fantastic. I don't know Bill. I've never spoken to him before. We don't have any kind of rapport, and I have no reason to believe he has any idea who I am. But he responded to me very quickly. He gave me a very thorough response, including matching the level of nerdery that I sent to him. Like, he told me specific numbers, what is their tolerances, what is their spec, how deep the ball is supposed to go in, and all of that. Like, his response to me was fantastic. So I want to give huge props and credit to Bill for giving me, and he said, Like he explained what the intended design is, and he said that this is the way it's intended to behave. But he did say that they would be happy to take it in if I want to send it in and make sure, guarantee that it's within spec, and tune it and fix it if it's not. So like the response he gave was spectacular. I want to give huge props to him because that's exactly the kind of customer service response I would want. But as I said, his response made it pretty clear to me that this is the intended behavior. This is how it's supposed to be. And I don't think it should be like that. You can thumb flick this, but you have to like really intentionally go out again like that. And this is also the kind of detent that you can't really do anything about. Like you can lighten this lock bar pressure, right? So by lightening this lock bar pressure, by bending this out some, what you're gonna do is make it so that the actual detent itself is less firm. And so maybe I would be able to flick like this, but it's the shape of this and everything that's making that really hard. But the problem is that even if you lighten this lock bar pressure, it still has the same design of being super, super deep in and up against a very flat surface. And what that means is that even if you lighten the lock bar pressure, it's still gonna be extremely sensitive to any pressure on the lock bar from your fingers. And so like, there's just nothing you can do about that. The only way that you could fix that is in production itself by making the hole that this sits in just smaller or offset so that it doesn't sit fully deep. You can't really make the hole smaller. So on knives where this doesn't sit deep enough and it sits like there, you can, it's not an easy mod for a normal person to do, but you can increase the size of a detent hole to compensate. But if the hole is so big that it sits too deep, there's not really anything you can do. You can't make it a smaller hole. You can't add metal back in. And so even if I lightened this lock bar pressure, this would still be the kind of thing where me putting my finger here would make it so that it just freaking doesn't deploy. It just locks up. So yeah, I don't think it should be like this. And there's not really anything I can do about it. I went around and I actually asked, just to be sure, I went and I asked a whole bunch of people that have Ariuses, especially people that absolutely love the Ariuses, if this is the way they behave. And what I learned is that this is how they behave, and this is something that they did for Gen 4. That with Gen 4 that they switched to this fully deep engagement and did that intentionally, and that the Gen 4s have this kind of lock bar sensitivity, and they have this kind of really intentional outward direction. Weirdly, the Gen 4s that are done in other materials, the carbon fiber, I talked to 4 different people that have carbon fiber versions of Gen 4s, and they, for whatever reason, don't behave the same way. And that doesn't make any sense to me, because on the carbon fiber ones, the backside is still titanium. So this whole backside, where all of this quote unquote problem, if you will, or design is, that should also be the same. But for whatever reason, the Gen 4s don't seem to work that way. The Gen 2s and 3s, I'm told, actually have a detent that is probably right up my alley. But the Gen 2s and 3s have other things that are different in terms of like how this flipper tab works that isn't quite as good, and just general little bits of refinement. So I'm kind of at this point where I think this is the ultimate version of this knife, in the sense of like this current, March of 2022 iteration is the version that I would want from the overall thing, and it just has a detent system that I don't like. I want to also point out that this is, like I said, it's so sensitive to the lock bar here, and this is a really big lock bar. Like, this isn't a knife that you can easily keep your fingers off of. It's a big knife and a big lock bar, and so it's the kind of thing where I have to be like pretty specific and almost a kind of awkward in how I hold it, just to be able to avoid this big lock bar. I do want to point out that Bill responded to the fact that this flexes out right here, and he said that that is a consequence of this change that they did with Gen 4. One of the things they did in Gen 4 is they extended the length of the lock bar, brought the lock face up higher, and moved the detent ball in. And all of that allows them to get a larger area of contact and lockup, which is going to give you a stronger lockup. And the moving the detent ball in further is what gives them the really, really short lever arm distance that allows them to be more drop shotty like that. Like Gen 4 is supposed to be by far the most drop shotty, and that is full guillotine. But what he says is that the consequence, and this makes total sense, the consequence of extending this lock bar, they couldn't bring this end up because of the way that this whole literally the hole. I was going to say the whole clip setup is, but literally the hole here means that they can't bring that forward. And so that means that the lock bar itself is physically longer than it used to be. And when the longer you make a lock bar, the more flexible it's going to be, because that's just how materials work. And so he said that he's aware of this kind of outward flex and bend that it does as you go, and that is something that developed as a result of them linking this lock bar. What are my final thoughts on this? I think the way that this moves, the sounds that it makes, the overall like complexity of the machining and everything, I think this is a really, really impressive knife. I think if this is a knife that would fit your hands in terms of the size you want, I think this is a really, really impressive knife. I think the fact that it fits so well in my hands, even when it is clearly too big for me, is also an incredibly impressive testament to the overall ergonomics of this. And it feels so good. They have chamfers in all the right spaces. This is a very impressive knife. And if the Detent was fundamentally different, if the Detent was not this thing that is super sensitive to lock bar pressure and all that, then I think I would enjoy deploying it a hell of a lot more, enough that I might even consider keeping it, just because I'm so impressed by some aspects of it that I'm comfortable having knives that are outside of my norm and that I don't carry all that often. And this could fall into that category for me if the Detent system was just done differently. But as is, the fact that I don't like the sensation of flicking it, that it wears into my finger there with how hard I have and how deliberately I have to press, yeah, that means that because it is too big and I know that I wouldn't carry very often, that is definitely not going to stick around. But I'm super freaking excited for the minis, because I think the minis will just change all of this. The size will fit me correctly to the point where it might just really click with me. And if he does change this Detent at all, or if just the different size of it and geometry, it means that it fits in my hand better in a way that makes it easier for me to deploy with the ways I normally like to deploy it, I could see the mini being a beloved knife in my collection. As is, the full-size one, it's not for me, and so it's going to move along. I said this in the unboxing as well. I appreciate when people offer to buy knives or ask if they can buy knives. I get that that's a generous thing that people are doing. It's nice that they want to help, but odds are by the time you're seeing this video, this knife is already long gone. So please don't leave a bunch of messages in the comments asking if you can buy it and asking if it's still around. Thank you guys for watching. Thanks again to Bill for giving me a great response to when I messaged him. Yeah, and oh yeah, thanks to Noah for letting me pick this up in the first place. This is something that I bought like new in box from my friend who also wanted to experience it and said it was just too big for him. And it was it's difficult to get these. It's really hard. They sell out immediately. And so thank you to him for helping me get the opportunity to check this out. Anyway, thank you guys for watching, and I'll catch you guys next time.